Hello everyone, Rob Rousseau here, just reminding you to please smash the subscribe button as well as the bell and the thumbs up, leave a comment, and hey, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe over on Patreon, patreon.com/Rob Rousseau. Okay, that's all. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
So yeah, thank you again for coming back on the show. It's a real delight to have you back. How have you been doing?
I'm doing fine. It's been a crazy couple of months, really, in a way.
Yes.
Trying to sort out. It's just a lot of things that are complicated, I think, in the world.
Yeah.
And I find myself sometimes a little bewildered by, I guess the way in which people want to think about reality. That bewilders me.
Yeah.
There's a way, the kind of rush to make comments without really studying things. And I find that puzzling, like for instance, this business in Ukraine now with the German tanks, all the media commentary is about tanks, right? Germany must allow Poland to send tanks. Well, this really interested me a lot because you remember the beginning of the war when Russian tanks entered Ukraine, they were basically wiped out very quickly. And in recent months, the Russians haven't been using a ground operation. They've been hitting Ukraine hard with missiles. So what do the Ukrainians propose to do with the tanks if this is not really a tank battle? And then, but nobody was asking the question, like, is there really a tank confrontation? Will the Leopard tanks be facing Russian tanks or Abrams tanks from the US? Well, the fact is this may have nothing to do with tanks. It might have something to do with using the tanks debate to strong arm Germany into fully backing Ukraine, or whatever. I don't even know what's going on. But all I could tell was that people in the mainstream, story number one, lead story, Russia hammers Ukraine with missiles. Okay, that's story number one. Story number two, Ukraine must have tanks. And I'm thinking, listen, journalists and editors, how is a tank going to deal with a missile? Put your two stories together. And I'm not a military expert. I never would presume to be one. But it's super illogical, that you're first reporting there are missile strikes coming in. And missiles, are basically supersonic weapons for which you need extraordinarily sophisticated means to retaliate, like missile batteries of various kinds by themselves. But a tank that whizzes around, on the countryside, how is that going to deal with, a missile? So I was like, what's going on in the media? Like basic logical flaws or inconsistencies don't seem to be of concern, There's a debate in Ramstein around the tanks. Well, let's focus on the tanks. Well, weird. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, what you're pointing out of the issue with kind of mainstream press, especially in the West as well, it's a problem it's a generational problem, but it's something that I think has been, there's been a real magnifying glass put on that by the last year of this war in Ukraine. I was actually just watching back our previous conversation, which took place about 3 weeks or so before the invasion kicked off. And it was very fascinating kind of talking about that, and discussing sort of the context about all the discussions that was going on now and how we were kind of talking about how Ukraine was being led along by these Western powers. And we're kind of trying at that time to tone down the rhetoric a little bit because they realized that they were potentially going to get involved with something that was going to be very destructive and harmful to the country. So it's been kind of fascinating to look at those comments in the context of the last year. And I think, what you're talking about with the media, I think the thing that what has stuck out for me over the last year of kind of following this conflict and also just paying close attention to the media coverage of it is the way that here in the West, I know it's not the same all over the world, but if you're living in one of these Western countries, part of the rules-based international order or what have you, there's been this extremely one-sided view of this conflict, and only, in terms of like the debate that happens or in the coverage that happens of this conflict, the only viewpoint that's ever really able to be articulated in any kind of mainstream press is how many weapons go to Ukraine and how much funding and how much training goes to these militias, not whether we should be contributing to this conflict or whether we should be escalating it, but how much, what's the level of escalation that we need? That's been the only viewpoint that's been allowed to be expressed basically in mainstream press now for the last year. Just this endless cheerleading for further escalation of the conflict, and any kind of dissenting viewpoint of that has been completely suppressed from the mainstream press, or maybe sometimes it takes place in far right media, which is another kind of a really alarming thing. But anyone who has suggested, we shouldn't escalate this conflict, anyone who's pointed out, the role that Canada and the United States and these Western countries played in provoking the conflict or talking about this context has been completely suppressed and completely silenced. And the only room that there's been in terms of this discussion is how much can we escalate and how fast, and how many more weapons and tanks and bombs and missiles can we get to Ukraine? And I think that's probably the most alarming thing about watching this coverage play out and this conflict play out.
I mean, what does one say? Honestly, literally, I'm at a loss, because there are people who at one point, 20 odd years ago, stood quite strongly against the warmongering in Iraq and so on. Very strong anti-war voices of one kind or the other. Now those very voices are cheerleading for more weapons for Ukraine. And let's be frank, this war has to end in a negotiation, because there are only two ways for wars to end. And I would like to see more public discussion about this. One is the radical, complete, total defeat of an adversary. Like Nazis were defeated in World War II, and then they were brought to Nuremberg and tried, and some escaped to South America, and some committed suicide and whatever. But they were defeated, roundly defeated. Okay, that's one way in which a war can end. And then the United States kind of used denazification to both promote some Nazis into Western intelligence services, and then sort of, allowed the others to enter into mainstream West German society. Okay, that's one approach, the complete total defeat. Second approach is a kind of negotiation. Okay, and in a negotiation, all sides have to, deal with the fact that they have to live with each other. Okay. Total defeat is actually not possible anymore. The West is simply not going to allow Ukraine to experience a total defeat. I think that Polish armies might cross the border and so on. It's a horrifying scenario, but they are simply not going to allow permanent defeat. And by the way, the Germans were not keen on giving Leopard tanks to Ukraine because they didn't want to provoke the ire of the Russians, frankly. And the United States had to come in and say, okay, we'll give 31 Abrams tanks, which was effectively a kind of nuclear umbrella over Germany. That the United States was saying, look, we're coming in this with Germany. So Germany is not alone. So we're going to be there. And that was an insurance policy for Olaf Scholz, also pressure. Okay. So Ukraine is not going to be allowed to be defeated, okay, regardless of what everybody is saying. Secondly, there is no defeat for Russia, in my opinion, okay, because Putin might resign, he might decide to take off, or he might be overthrown, him personally. But rooted in Russian society now is a deep patriotic seam where people simply don't want to return to the humiliations of the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed. So Russia is not going to permit a defeat, okay? It's not just about Putin. United Russia is a big political party. They have deep roots in the society. So there's going to be no possibility of either Ukraine or Russia facing a total defeat. Okay, if you foreclose that option, total defeat, then you're going to have to deal with the fact that there's going to be a negotiation. Now, unless the United States is prepared to use its incredibly, 1970s technology from Star Trek and dig a trench around Ukraine and bring its giant helicopters and lift up the entire Ukrainian territory and move it to Iowa, unless the US is prepared to do that, the Ukrainians are going to have to live next to the Russians. That's just a reality of geography. Ukraine cannot build a giant wall that, is not going to allow it to deal with the Russians. It's just not going to happen. Ukrainians are going to have to deal with the Russians. They are not moving to Iowa. And besides, if all Ukrainians move to Iowa, there'd be an enormous anti-Ukrainian sentiment in the United States, which is prone to anti-immigrant sentiment, and that too Slavic immigrants. Let's not forget that Slavic immigrants, well, that's at a different level. You see, the whole Brexit debate in Britain was about Polish migrants to Britain. That was all the cliches that abounded, So Ukraine is going to have to deal with the Russians. And right now, the West effectively is basically telling Ukraine, don't negotiate with the Russians. Don't deal with the Russians. But this is terrible for Ukraine's people and for Ukraine's history to come. It is far better for Ukraine now. And I'm not saying concessions, surrender. I'm saying negotiate. Far better, negotiate. And, look, frankly, what are the issues that the Russians put on the table at Minsk II? And now we know from Angela Merkel, now we know from Francois Hollande that the West was using Minsk II as a way to just drag out time and
they're just buying time.
Buying time. I mean, they said it, I'm not saying it. I'm just quoting from them, they said it. Okay, fine. But still, what were the issues the Russians raised? Number one, Donetsk, Lugansk, in other words, the Donbass region has a significant Russian majority population. They were seeking autonomy. At the time of Minsk, there was no conversation about Lugansk and Donetsk joining Russia. It was merely the Russians were seeking autonomy for the Russian-speaking population, Russian ethnic population inside Ukraine. Secondly, Crimea had already come and joined Russia. But there was a real problem, which is that the Ukrainian government stopped allowing water to be supplied to Crimea. So the Russians built at great expense a bridge to send the water by tanker. One of the demands in Minsk II was restart the water. If not, and this is what the Russians did, they built that land bridge through Mariupol. Okay, so look, there are bits and pieces here for a negotiated settlement. I doubt that Donbass is going to return to Ukraine. Okay, that's gone. The Ukrainians are going to have to sign that off. I very much doubt that the Russians will withdraw from Mariupol without a permanent guarantee of water supply to Crimea, and that Crimea's, accession into Russia is basically accepted by Ukraine. I mean, these are the basic negotiating points. Zelensky knows, because he was elected on a peace campaign, that he's going to have to negotiate, but he has bought the fantasy that has been sold to him by the Boris Johnsons, by the Bidens. I mean, these mediocre Western warrior state politicians, extraordinarily mediocre people. Biden, the guy can't string, and by the way, it's not true that Biden can't string sentences together because he's an elderly man. It's not true. Biden couldn't string sentences together when he was a young man. Go back and listen to tape of Biden at the Anita Hill hearing. He struggles to put sentences together. This is the mediocrity of Western warrior state, so-called democratic leaders. Boris Johnson, good God, man. But Zelensky basically was hornswaggled, a good old-fashioned hard-scrabble word from the US prairies. They hornscrabbled Zelensky into this mentality that you can win, you can prevail. I mean, he's wearing camouflage t-shirts that are one size too small for him. What kind of business is this? This is not good for the Ukrainian people. I'm not saying that the Russians are doing anything heroic. I'm not getting into that whole debate, I'm just talking practicalities. What's the out? The out is there's nobody going to win. And secondly, you're going to have to negotiate. You got to negotiate in good faith. Otherwise, it's not going to last for another generation.
Yeah, well, I mean, you talk about this idea of total defeat, which has been sold as the only possible solution that's for Ukrainians and their supporters. Not only the total defeat of Russia in this invasion, but also getting Russia out of Crimea, which just seems to be completely so far away from anything resembling reality that it's just, I don't know how you can expect to have a genuine, sincere conversation about how this conflict should be managed and how it should end, if that's what the starting point is for a lot of these folks in the sort of imperialist camp or the Western camp. I mean, that's just completely fantasy land, the idea that that's going to be a possibility. But there's a lot of people that are just maintaining that that's the only possible outcome for this. And many comfortable Western journalists as well that have made caring about Ukraine and Ukrainian sovereignty and democracy their main sort of like political cause that they believe in, are very adamant about this. But again, these are people that don't have to live in these regions that are just undergoing this struggle and the bombings and the destruction that the folks that are living there now are living under. You know, it's very kind of sad to see this conversation play out in our media and in our journalism, and to have anyone advocating for an actual settlement or a dialogue like you are, be kind of totally marginalized in our media or in our discourse.
Look, frankly, I'm in favor of, and I'm not a peacenik in that sense, but I'm in favor of all negotiations everywhere. I would like to see immediate negotiations for Yemen, where the situation is catastrophic. I mean, we need the end to the war in Yemen, but British arms manufacturers like, BAE Systems making lots of money selling arms to the Saudis to pummel the Yemenis. US arms manufacturers making lots of money, to sell weapons to parties that are then transferring it to Ukraine. By the way, the United States, in the middle of military exercises with Israel, Juniper Oak military exercise, while this massacre takes place in Jenin, and then the US asking Israel, because, I don't know if people know this well, but the United States warehouses a ton of weapons in Israel. It's a way, part of that $38 billion military aid package. United States warehouse. So the US has asked Israel to basically ship, out of date weapons to Ukraine so that the Israeli arsenal can get new weapons, in its place so they can pummel the Palestinians. Again, last night, the Israelis bombed Gaza again after the massacre of 10 people, 9 in Jenin and 1 in Al-Ram, just north of Jerusalem. I mean, there is a way in which the arms industry is benefiting greatly from, the prolongation of these wars. I'm in favor of all these wars being negotiated down because they're all political conflicts that require political settlements. I mean, look, the other war that needs to be negotiated is the war between the Israelis. It's not even a war. It's actually a UN designated occupation. But the occupation of the Palestinians, then there needs to be some way out. I mean, we need, again, a kind of global conference of finding a way out. What's happening in Mozambique, what's happening in Cameroon, where hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced in a conflict around French-speaking Cameroon and English-speaking Cameroon, and then every few days somebody's killed on the Nigeria-Cameroon border. All this stuff is completely, obscured by the singular focus on Ukraine. All the other conflicts that need negotiation, they need the presence of, serious parties to lead them in negotiation. I mean, that's one thing, is that rather than provide space for negotiation, those who ask for it pilloried as agents of God knows what. The other day, somebody is calling me a Duginist. I said, look, I don't know anything about Duginism. I've been a Marxist my whole life, almost, as far as I remember. I don't need any new ideology now. I'm quite okay with Marxism. So, you don't need to impute something on me. You want to know what I believe? Ask me what I believe. I'll tell you, I'm a Marxist. This assessment comes from my understanding of Marxism. Don't throw Putin is, Duginist, Xi Jinping is, all this stuff at me. I have my own opinions. You can write what you want with a Sharpie on my body, but I'll shower it off. It doesn't impact me. It's not a permanent marker, I can tell you that. So the point is that we who call for negotiations can be called whatever, but the fact of the matter is, you don't negotiate, the arms industry benefits. You don't negotiate, people get hurt. You don't negotiate, the very people that you claim to be speaking in the name of are getting their lives damaged for generations. I covered the war in Iraq. I know how bad these things are, how intergenerational the trauma is. I find a lot of these people are kind of long distance warriors. They want somebody else to fight their fights. They will wear camouflage, but send somebody else to die.
Yeah.
There was an old Pink Floyd song about this, which I very much like, about, people who send other people to do their fighting. And Roger, who wrote the song, wrote it about people like George W. Bush and so on, who sent young working class people from the United States to fight in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so on, for wars that they would never go to fight themselves or send their own children to fight in. So yes, I would call for peace in this conflict and in others, because the price of continuing this war is just not acceptable for the planet.
No, it's not acceptable for the planet, but as you're pointing out, it's great for all the weapons manufacturers that are making a killing with the endless arms transfers going to Ukraine. They don't even know who they're going to half the time, and that doesn't seem to be a problem for them. And I think like what the point of what we're talking about here is as well is that for I think a lot of the Western imperialists who have like helped provoke this conflict in a deliberate effort to destabilize Russia, who's their geopolitical enemy, even though they talk about total defeat of Russia while simultaneously knowing that's not really a possibility, because they want it to be an endless quagmire for the Russian government. Like they don't actually care about the people of Ukraine that actually live in this environment. Quagmires like we saw in Afghanistan, like we saw in Vietnam and elsewhere, that's great business for the American arms manufacturers that are pumping weapons into this country. And I think another thing, like you're pointing out as well, I think it's important to mention also that a lot of the belligerence with which the West has sort of treated Russia, both in the past and like the way that this conflict has been promoted from people in the West and supported, has actually empowered a lot of really reactionary elements, undercurrents in Russian society, like you were talking about. Like there's this whole much even more chauvinistic, nationalistic kind of sect in Russian society that view Putin as going too soft on Ukraine, and it's empowering the absolute worst people on both sides of the conflict. The longer it goes on and the longer this quagmire continues. But again, it's great business for the arms manufacturers and all these massive corporations now that are talking about getting involved in the rebuilding effort, BlackRock and Goldman Sachs and all these multinationals that Zelensky is now kind of appealing to.
I mean, to me, let's focus on this a little bit, because to me, what's extraordinary is the willingness of the Europeans to sacrifice their project to the United States. That's incredible. Like, for instance, after World War II, the European project, which eventually became, the customs union, and then would become the European Economic Community, and then the European Union, and so on. This project was supposed to bring in a bunch of European countries to create, maybe common trading platforms, and also eventually a common foreign policy. That was part of the deal. In fact, now the European Union has a kind of foreign policy leader. She's useless, but there's a supposed independent foreign policy. Well, when all this was happening, only one country actually said, look, frankly, one country in Western Europe said, frankly, we're not that keen on this, European project, because it seems like a Trojan horse for US power. So the whole European Economic Community is a little bit like NATO, which looks like it's European, North Atlantic Treaty Organization based in Brussels, but effectively it's a Trojan horse for the US. And that country was France, led by Charles de Gaulle, which is why a phrase developed called Gaullist foreign policy, where the French said, we want our own foreign policy. We want our own weapons industry, Rafale jet fighters and so on. We want to create our own military. And they also had pretensions of colonial glory and holding, they were in the middle of trying to maintain their empire in Vietnam and Algeria. They were getting pummeled by people. Anyway, this Gaullist idea was there. So in Europe, there's been a debate whether Europe should be effectively the Trojan horse of the United States or should develop its own policies. there was an idea to create a European arms industry. Well, that was created. A lot of weapon systems created. There was a European aircraft manufacturing company that made the Airbus. That was a European consortium and so on. Well, the US in the last 15 years has attempted to subordinate Europe. Any ambition of Europe to have independence has to be crushed. Europe in the last 15 years started to develop very close ties with China and with Russia. Russian gas and energy coming in. And the US was frustrated about this. A lot of what's going on now is the attempt to break Europe from Russia and China, bring Europe back to its subordinate status to the United States, and ensure that these traditions of Gaullism and so on are marginalized. Look, I know that if you raise this issue, somebody will say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. But I just want to encourage people to think of something. Russia, as a consequence of the terribly stupid US NATO wars against, Iraq, Iran, and Libya, Russia became a major energy supplier to Europe. Well, in order to provide energy to Europe, they felt, look, we're going to have to build pipelines. So they built pipelines through Poland, Ukraine, whatever. And these governments started to say, we want more of the profit or from the natural gas that passes through our land. So the Russians, in collaboration with the Germans and various private companies, built Nord Stream 2. They built a pipeline through the northern seas to come from Russia directly into Germany. Well, okay, it's a normal pipeline. There are pipelines all over the world, okay? It's not unusual. Nord Stream 2 was not like some great feat. It's a normal pipeline under the water bringing natural gas. Okay, Mr. Trump, when he was president, goes to NATO headquarters, yells at them and says that, you're wasting billions of dollars buying natural gas from Russia, and then you expect us to protect you from Russia. That's a direct quote from Trump, by the way. So the US has been furious about Nord Stream for a long time. During this war, Biden was asked in a press conference, what do you think about Nord Stream? And he says, no, we're going to get rid of it. And then the journalist very sincerely asked him, what do you mean? And he said, no, we're going to get rid of it. Okay, Victoria Nuland then comes before the House Senate Foreign Relations. By the way, she was the woman in the Maidan who was on the phone saying, let's get rid of blah, blah, blah.
Yats is our guy. Yeah.
Now, and then she comes before the US Congress and she says, well, Nord Stream, we're going to take care of it. We're going to take care of it. And then Nord Stream is blown up in passive voice. It disappears. Okay. And then
Crazy.
Vicky
Coincidence.
Clark, coincidence. Victoria Nuland comes back to the Senate and, says, she quotes, I think it was Ted Cruz or some other really ridiculous politician, and says, well, as you say, Senator, that is now a hunk of metal at the bottom of a sea. And it has been taken care of, she says in passive voice. Now, I am not saying that the United States torpedoed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I am not saying that, for the record. I am saying
saying it, but you can continue.
I am saying the following for the record. How is it that a major energy pipeline is blown up in the middle of a conflict and there is no investigation by any government of how
I thought they were looking into
pipeline
it.
blew up?
I thought they were really looking into it. At any moment now, their investigation is going to be
looking into anything. And frankly, the Russians haven't made too much noise about it either, which is like, their propaganda is really pathetic in that sense. Like, why aren't you raising this question at the United Nations? The question should be raised that do our pipelines open game in a war? Like, can submarines go around the world blowing up pipelines? Is that acceptable behavior? Or is there going to be an international treaty to prevent this? Or, just for the record, should we not establish what happened here? But no. Has the New York Times asked the question? No. Washington Post? No. The execrable Guardian? No. CNN? No. MSNBC, which shrieks and screams about everything? No. Has even Democracy Now! Asked that question? No. Nobody seems to care. A pipeline is blown up and nobody cares. Now, Rob, the reason I'm saying to you that I don't even need to know who did it is it's not relevant who actually blew it up. what's really revealing is that none of these countries care who did it, which means that everybody really knows who did it. And everybody knows who did it because in public, Vicky Newland says it was done. And before that, Biden said, we'll handle it. Who talks like that? We'll handle it. That's like mafia language.
Yeah.
We'll take care of it.
It'd be a damn shame if something happened to your pipeline. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like my favorite movie, Godfather 1. Luca Brasi sleeps with the fishes. When Vicky Newland comes there and says, it's a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea, it was a lot like Luca Brasi sleeps with the fishes. That was Vicky Newland's line to Ted Cruz. It's a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. That's it. Case closed. What kind of planet are we living on? What country is the United States? What's happened to journalism? Okay, what's happened to journalism? What a ridiculous thing to say. Okay, I'm old enough and I was there in Iraq when a lot of this stuff happened. But, the New York Times wrote a bunch of lies in their paper under the byline of Judith Miller. She lied about weapons of mass destruction. She lied about a ton of stuff. End of the day, the New York Times got rid of Judith Miller. They probably gave her a good payout. She probably has some sort of platform somewhere. I haven't heard about her for a long time. But the New York Times didn't have any repercussions. They didn't need to do a full investigation. Now, why I'm saying this? There was an editor of the New York Times who hired a young black journalist who apparently made up stories that he published in the New York Times. He apparently went and talked to people that didn't exist. And he wrote stories about race relations in the US. He made up stories. When he was found out, the editor was fired of the New York Times, and there was a multiple full-page story analysis of how his lies were able to get through the sophisticated editing standards of the newspaper on record. But when Judy Miller lied about a war that led to over 1 million people dead, she was let go, fair, but there was no public assessment of what damage she had caused in the New York Times and so on and so forth. So I don't have high expectations for the New York Times. I just want to put that out there.
Well, many of the journalists that supported and promoted Iraq,
yeah.
Many of the journalists that supported and promoted the Iraq war just failed upwards and were heavily rewarded for that, rather than facing any consequences for it. Interesting.
I mean, it was an illegal war. It was illegal by the standards of the United Nations.
Yeah.
So now when, US officials, high officials, say things like, well, the United States, we've never seen a illegal war like this. Okay, I've heard this many times, including from Condoleezza Rice, says on US television, never seen anything like this. What?
It's really unbelievable, I know.
I mean, Minister Rice, you were the National Security Advisor. You were there. You guys conducted what Kofi Annan, General Secretary of the UN, called an illegal war in Iraq. How can you and then these, journalists who are interviewing them don't interrupt, don't ask any questions. They don't say, but what about Iraq? And, the reason they don't say that is, listen to what I said. What about Iraq? Because then they get accused of whataboutery, and whataboutery, we know, is actually a propaganda device created by British intelligence against the Irish Republican Army in the 1980s. So, it's a completely comatose media. I get it. It's a comatose media. Nonetheless, a pipeline, to return to where I started on this, is destroyed and nobody seems to want to discuss it. And if you raise the question, then you get hit with the cliche, you're a conspiracy theorist. Well, I'm not even proposing a conspiracy. I'm merely asking you a question. How did that pipeline get blown up? Well, but you don't want to talk about it. How is that a conspiracy theory? I'm merely raising a question. Well, what's the answer, friend?
Yeah. The ultimate irony is that the people that hurl around the conspiracy theorist epithet at people are the ones that speculating that Russia is the one that bombed their own pipeline for whatever labyrinthine reason, and can never really quite explain that. But yeah, they don't qualify as this being shunted into this conspiracy theorist camp. And I think, like, you know, what you're talking about, and what I think we need to discuss, which is the primary contradiction as usual, which is imperialism. And I think when you describe this process of European countries such as France and Germany kind of going against their own interests at the behest of the U.S. State Department, that's a demonstration of the country that wields the imperialist power in the world. You know, as much as people have tried to use this kind of like Marxist language to side with NATO and accuse Russia of imperialism, it's not just about invading a country, but it's forcing these countries to commit economic suicide at their behest, or to back their proxy war in Ukraine, even though it's going to destroy their own access to cheap energy. It's getting, you know, countries like France and Germany off of that Russian gas and onto fracked gas from the United States at a significantly marked up price, which is going to be devastating to the actual people that have to live there and pay for the energy prices. And I think when we see that process playing out, and also the ways that, you know, the United States primarily in the Western countries control these flows of information, these massive media corporations to control this narrative, we're seeing, you know, in real time an example of like who's wielding imperialist power in the world. And it's not quite as simple as just saying, well, if you invade a country, it's imperialism. We're seeing who wields the imperialist power, you know, and you know, it's not Russia in this case.
I mean, what you say is absolutely true. Okay, you know, there is a powerful country smashing other countries into submission. Okay, but let's look at these other countries just as an exercise. I was in Glasgow at the COP26 meeting, the meeting on climate change. Okay, at Glasgow, Europeans, including Biden, when he was not asleep, were chastising India and China for burning coal. Not only India and China, the whole global south, for using coal. Using coal, but with much lower carbon footprint per capita than any Western country. I mean, the United States continues to be, despite all this personal recycling and all this stuff, US continues to be the major per capita carbon footprint in the world. And on top of that, and worse than that, the Pentagon is the world's largest institutional polluter. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, all of that. But they were yelling at the global south countries, you're using coal, you're disgusting, whatever. Meanwhile, in Germany, the great Green Party of Germany, which emerged in an environmental platform, that's why they are called Green Party. Now with this war, firstly, they have become the great warmongers. You know, even during the war in Afghanistan, they became the biggest warmongers, you know, at the time. Anyway, this war, the Greens are to the right of even the Christian Democrats on this war. And the Green Party is perfectly happy with Germany perhaps restarting its nuclear plants. I mean, start your coal-fired plants again. For God's sake, while you're at it, burn down the whole damn Black Forest, you know, for all I care. Because you are hypocrites. Yesterday, you were yelling at everybody saying, got to save the planet, this, that, and the other. Today, as you're quite rightly say, you're willing to import US fracked natural gas, which has been liquefied. Okay, so the enormous energy footprint of liquefying already disgustingly produced natural gas with impact on Native American lands and so on, aka Standing Rock, let's remember that. All of that. And then you got to ship it across the Atlantic. That's another part of the carbon footprint. Then you've got to bring it back to the gaseous state in Hamburg or wherever, and then pipe it into homes. It's much more expensive, but also greater carbon footprint. Okay, it's grotesque. So you're the Greens, self-righteous Green Party that was lecturing everybody. Now you're willing to burn down the Black Forest effectively to continue a ludicrous war against the Russians. You know, frankly, people around the world, you know, on the continents of Africa and so on, are laughing at these people. They're laughing at them because it's not only the hypocrisy, it's the stupidity. You know, these are stupid people. Look, the United States tried to intervene. You know, the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, CELAC, met in Buenos Aires this week. It's a big meeting because Lula brought Brazil back into CELAC and he was the leader, the hero of the hour and so on. He went to meet Pepe Mujica and they sat in Mujica's little bug and so on. It's an incredible meeting happening. What was the US intervention? Okay, I don't know if people saw this. United States Southern Command, which is the military wing of US imperialism in the Americas, put out a message to its friendly countries in South America, like Peru, which is a coup country, and told them, send weapons to Ukraine. So the US is trying to use the send your weapons to Ukraine as a way of getting their allies on side, because they don't have any other project for the people. They don't have money. They don't have investment that they're willing to do. They don't want to transfer technology. They can just browbeat people and say, why don't you fly the Ukrainian flag, and you've got to send your weapons to help Ukraine. People in most of the world listen to that and go, are you crazy? I mean, why are we going to get involved in that conflict? We want to make trade deals with the United States and with China and with Russia. We don't want to get involved in your great power dynamics that you're imposing on the world. It's an interesting situation, Rob. I mean, right now, many countries around the world looking at this situation, they're like, wow, man, Green Party in Europe. I mean, what are these people, and the animosity against, and maybe people don't use the word imperialism, but the animosity against Western arrogance is now at a high level, not only in China, where there's a new revival of animosity towards Western arrogance, which had not been there 10 years ago. 10 years ago, in Chinese intellectual circles, there was a real pro-American bias that has disappeared, that has evaporated. In India, where just a few years ago, huge pro-American bias among the middle class, evaporating. Why? Because people are like, we don't want to be bullied around. I talked about Glasgow. At Glasgow, I gave an intervention and I used two concepts, colonial mentality and colonial structure. And that little clip of a speech went viral all over the world, but in India as well. And in India, it was circulating in right-wing WhatsApp groups. The Prime Minister of India, who's a bloody fascist guy, quoted my speech. His foreign minister quoted it. And they now use the term colonial mentality and colonial structure. For me, it's very weird because, I'm a completely different part of the political spectrum than Narendra Modi. I think he's a fascist. I'm, a Marxist. But they took those phrases, colonial mentality, colonial structure, and they, pushed it forward. And so they are representing, in a way, this change in the mood in India, which is similar to the change in the mood on the African continent and so on. People in the United States, Canada, whatever, need to wake up to the fact that the continents of Latin America, Asia, they are experiencing a new kind of political and intellectual transformation. I don't know where it's going to go. I don't want to exaggerate it, but you can feel this in the air. There is a change of mood. Where it goes, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, to your point, I think we talked about the media and the very one-sided portrayal of this conflict, and the way that our media figures and political figures here in the middle of the empire, the heart of the empire, create this illusion of consensus about Ukraine. The whole world stands with Ukraine, and using this kind of rhetoric while completely ignoring the feel like these are all just the former colonialist countries, essentially, when they say the whole world, right? And completely ignoring the entirety of the global South, which is much more neutral on it, and in some cases, like a lot more sympathetic to Russia, and completely kind of ignoring that context. And I think that's one thing that's been very interesting to notice, especially when you bring up India, is the way that this shift is happening. And that not only do you have, these formerly colonized countries in Latin America or elsewhere or Africa, taking a neutral stance on this, but you even have like very reactionary, usually dependable Western allies such as India or even Saudi Arabia that are kind of hedging on this a little more, and they're not backing the United States even when they're being demanded to do so. And it's really indicative of this shift right now in global power, this shift away from this unipolar US-led world order to more of a multipolarity world. And that's, I think, seeing specifically these very reactionary places in terms of their governments, like India and Saudi Arabia refusing to back the U.S. on this is such a prime example of it. And I mean, just talking about China as well and the burgeoning sort of anti-U.S. Sort of school of thought there, that's not hard to understand either when you see the way that American politicians and people in the media and powerful interests are kind of trying to provoke a conflict using Taiwan in the exact same way they've used Ukraine to destabilize Russia. You know that there's a powerful thirst amongst these imperialists to create another proxy war against China and to use Taiwan to destabilize China. And the interesting thing is that we've seen, despite the provocations, and you see like with the visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, China has kind of refused to take the bait, and they've refused to rise to these provocations in the same way that Russia did. But I mean, it feels a little bit like it's only a matter of when until eventually the imperialists provoke the kind of conflict that they're attempting to with Taiwan. And it's not surprising that anti-U.S. sentiment is rising in China as a result of these kind of provocations.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that China is not rising to the provocation, because I want to say something about the current discussion about multipolarity. You see, I very much agree that the age of unipolarity is over. But what comes after unipolarity? Let's take the case of what's happening in the African continent. The United States has done a full court press. Blinken went there. Lloyd Austin went there. Now Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, is doing a tour. They're basically all telling African countries, don't deal with the Russians, don't deal with the Chinese. That's what they're saying, pretty openly.
They're coming with the lectures.
Pardon?
They're coming with the lectures.
Yeah, they are with the lectures. China's foreign minister, Qin Gang, first overseas trip was to Africa. He went to about 5 to 8 countries: Gabon, Benin, Egypt, Ethiopia, and so on. In Ethiopia, he inaugurated the African Center for Disease Control, which was basically built with Chinese support. At that period, he gave a very interesting speech. And he said, the relationship of powers like China to Africa should not be one of confrontation. We don't want to have confrontation with the West around China. We don't want China to be, Africa. We don't want Africa to be the battleground of a proxy war between the United States. What the African countries need collaboration. And he talked about healthcare and the so-called Health Silk Road as a way forward. In my reading, the Chinese, the Russians, the Brazilians, the Indians, and so on, they don't want to set up alternative poles. They don't want that. They want a multilateral system. They want the United Nations and its structures to operate democratically. The Chinese don't want to establish a Chinese pole, because what they say is, and I agree with them, that multipolarity leads to war. You need more global cooperation. You don't want the situation like World War I. The British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Tsarist Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, and then they sort of all mobilize and go to war with each other as they create different alliances and so on. What the Chinese have said openly, repeatedly, and Qin Gang says it as well when he got brought into the foreign ministry. He used to be the Chinese ambassador to the US. They don't want to be a pole. They want to live in a system of multilateral institutions that mediate conflicts among regions and countries. What I learned in my travels to many of these countries is that people want to establish regional institutions. CELAC for Latin America, Shanghai Cooperation Organization for Asia, strengthen the African Union, and so on. Regional organizations, building up the importance of multilateralism. I mean, that's why China even joined the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter. It's a body of a group of countries that have come together inside the UN, saying, let's strengthen multilateralism and the UN Charter. So I think we are entering into an interesting period. I think it's too quick to say, oh, it's going from unipolarity, and to use the word polarity both times. Unipolarity to multipolarity. No. It's going from unipolarity to regionalism, with a great interest in strengthening multilateral systems like the UN, maybe like BRICS as well, and so on, which is a multilateral international body, but not establish competing poles, competition, Cold Wars, and all that. Neither Russia nor China have indicated an interest in reviving or getting involved in a US imposed new Cold War on the planet.
Well, I definitely don't doubt that China and Russia want to try to avoid that conflict and want to try to avoid becoming this pole opposite U.S. hegemony. But the question is, and I think if you've studied U.S. history, as I know you have with your book Washington Bullets, which I received as a Christmas gift this year, and I was very thankful to get it.
Wow. Okay.
But the question is whether the United States is just going to sit idly back while these new regional institutions are formed, and such as BRICS and such as this new competing sort of economic order. Even if these countries are engaging in a completely productive way and in a non-antagonistic way, the U.S. views these kinds of shifts as a direct threat to their hegemony over controlling the entire global financial system and encircling the globe with their military bases, etc. As much as these intentions might be good, my concern, and I think the concern for a lot of people that are watching these forces kind of play out, is that regardless of the good intentions, the United States is going to take these kind of shifts as being provocations and respond to it with increasing belligerence and violence. The more powerful these forces become. Is that a concern of yours as well?
Well, look, I wrote a book called The Darker Nations about 15 years ago. A new edition has just come out, in which it's basically about the development of non-alignment, the Bandung spirit and all that. The United States refused to accept the concept of non-alignment. They called it neutralism. The Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles in the lead, running the CIA and the State Department. It's scandalous that Washington, D.C. has 2 airports named after scoundrels. One after the Dulles brothers and the other after Ronald Reagan. What about a Malcolm X International Airport or something? That's something to aspire to. Anyway, the United States refused to accept non-alignment. And that's why they went on a hardcore exercise of coupping governments, Lumumba 61, the government of Goulart, which is not even a left government, in Brazil in 64, the government Sukarno 65, all the way out to Chile 73 and so on. They just wouldn't accept non-alignment. Most of these were not communist governments. Goulart was not a communist. Arbenz in Guatemala was not a communist. Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, not a communist. They simply wanted to develop a non-aligned posture, not allowed. So I agree with you. I'm not naive about this. Any country today that simply says, look, we want a multilateral future, Venezuela, whack them. We want a multilateral future, Cuba, whack them. We want a multilateral future, Brazil, whack it, get rid of Lula, this attitude in DC is there. That is why the rest of the world needs to have a big movement inside the United States that at least sends, 20, 30 people moderately, slightly to the left of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, maybe not slightly, but quite a bit to her left.
Yeah, we can go further.
20, 30 of them need to go to Washington. There needs to be, a fifth column there that's preventing the United States from essentially doing this kind of mischief around the world, okay? No country coups governments as much as the US. And look at bloody Elon Musk, we'll coup anybody we want. Elon, for God's sake, man. I know you're a playful, funny guy, because Elon on his own Twitter account wrote state-affiliated media. So I immediately asked him on Twitter, which state are you affiliated with? A lot of people wrote pretty funny things like state of denial and state of this or whatever.
The deep state.
But the fact is that he did speak the truth when he said, we'll coup anybody we want, because that's the attitude of the US oligarchy, of the let's call it what they are, okay, of the not the plutocracy. What is the nice word they use in Russia to describe billionaires? Very interesting word. They call them oligarchs. Only Russia, it seems, has oligarchs. Elon Musk, these people are not called oligarchs. So let's start calling them oligarchs. The Western oligarchs, for instance, Bezos, Musk, and so on, this is their attitude. We don't like it, we're going to whack you. It's the attitude, they behave effectively. They effectively behave like mafia bosses. We just don't like it, you're gone. That attitude has to be suffocated. And the only way to suffocate that attitude is politically inside countries like the United States, where US allies also say, we're not interested in this behavior anymore. We're going to have to live on a planet. Look, Australia, largest trading partner, China. Australia totally reliant on China. Yet Australia behaves like a lily pad for US power and ambitions. The Australian ruling class has to be put on notice by the Australian people. It's ridiculous, ludicrous behavior. They're going to now base B-1 and B-52 bombers in northern Australia to threaten China. As if the Australian people need this kind of tension. You want to start a conflict with China at that level? It was one thing to have like a Scott Morrison, who really is a moronic. I have to say this again, Rob. The word mediocre doesn't even describe people like Rob Morrison, Justin Trudeau, Joe Biden. These people are completely zero. They have no depth at all. Yes, they are manufactured by a public relations company. Okay, maybe Joe Biden is a really bad product of a public relations company. But Justin Trudeau, how often can you get away with just flicking your hair and pretending to look cute and get through the day?
Have you seen his socks, though? They're really something else.
Well, did you see him getting scolded by Xi Jinping?
That was wonderful. Yeah, I loved that.
That was interesting, boss. That was interesting because there you got to see the character and caliber of world leaders. Xi comes from a history. The guy was sent to the countryside. He lived in a rural area. The guy then becomes manages entire provinces. People don't understand this. When they say China is authoritarian, I ask them, how much do you really know about China? For instance, who does the real governing in China? Well, the Communist Party, Xi Jinping. You don't know anything. The real governing in China happens at the provincial level. Provincial governors are the most powerful people in terms of the setting of provincial policy. Now, the policy is set by the Politburo of a communist party that's 96 million members, are involved in that party. And please, if you ever say, well, they are all robots, you've never met a Chinese Communist Party member, because you put 5 of them in the room and there are 12 opinions. So, people who have a racist idea of China never talk to real Chinese people, let alone Chinese people in their government or in their Communist Party. Their opinions to me are worth nothing. But let's just stick with this for a second. Xi Jinping is trained out of that tradition. The guy he wasn't just the prime minister of his country because his pop was the prime minister, okay? Pop being prime minister, you are prime minister. What is Justin Trudeau's curriculum vitae? My pop was the prime minister. What was Biden's curriculum vitae? He was the senator from Delaware, which is, hardly like, okay, I don't want to insult the people of Delaware, but they kept electing him. I don't know for what. And then eventually Obama picked him to be his vice president after several attempts at being president and losing, principally because I think Obama felt I need a tall white man on the ticket. I don't know why. But then
also has a history of extremely reactionary political actions that he's taken, so I can appeal to these kind of white moderates that I need to build and put in my coalition.
Yeah. But there's nothing there. The guy is empty, what comes out of him? Nothing. That's Biden. I mentioned Trudeau. Scott Morrison of Australia was at another level. Literally an empty suit, who said really stupid things. Unnecessarily started saying that, China has deliberately created COVID-19. Oh my God, dude, and suddenly you are not a conspiracy theorist for saying something as odd duck and stupid as that. I mean, just because you're the Prime Minister of Australia doesn't immunize you from being charged with stupid conspiracy mongering, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and on that point too, that whole conversation with Xi Jinping and Justin Trudeau was over reporting in Canadian media that China was like interfering in our political system or whatever, and then leaks about that, those conversations that were taking place appearing in our media, and Xi Jinping saying like, "What the fuck is this? Why are you? What this is not professional. Like, how are we supposed to have a discussion when you're leaking everything to the press?" And then Trudeau immediately walked back all his comments, which I thought was very funny and an example of like who is wielding this kind of global power and who's kind of pretending to wield it.
And not only that, do you remember how Trudeau turned around from the conversation?
Yeah, he kind of slunk away.
Yeah, he looked completely lost. And then and even his aide didn't come with him.
Yeah.
I thought that was funny, man. He was betrayed by his aide.
Yeah. That was very good. No, but you pointed out, I mean, it's like, let's talk about colonial mentality. We have so much, how Canadians feel comfortable, getting out the finger wagging lectures and talking about China and what they're doing. When you're talking, like you're pointing out, there's more people, by a large margin, there's more people in the Chinese Communist Party than there are people living in this country. But we still feel the need to lecture them about what they should or shouldn't do. It's absolutely preposterous that we think we have any leg to stand on when we're talking, talking to people in this country.
That is so interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That there are as many or more people in the Communist Party in China than there are in Canada. And meanwhile, I want to just point out a role that Canada has played recently that's very alarming.
Please do.
There are 8 countries that border the Arctic Circle. In fact, not just border, 8 countries that have an Arctic presence. Canada is one of them. Russia is another. In the 1990s, concerned about pollution in the Arctic, the 8 Arctic countries got together and created the Arctic Council. Canada played a role in this, in forming the Arctic Council. They meet periodically. They have conversations about, mining in the Arctic, pollution in the Arctic, declining Arctic ice, militarism in the Arctic, and so on. It's actually a really important multilateral body to have mutual, information sharing, and it sets some boundaries, but there's a lot of information sharing. Okay. United States is part of this because of Alaska, but also United States has a large military base in Greenland, which is a colony of Denmark. Don't forget that it's still colonized territory of the Danish kingdom. Anyway, the war breaks out in Ukraine, and Canada leads a rebellion in the Arctic Council, saying we will not come to the Arctic Council meetings if Russia is there, and essentially scuttles the Arctic Council. Now, why is this scuttling of the Arctic Council so significant? With retreating sea ice, more military bases are being built there, and it is discovered that there are almost trillions of dollars worth of rare earth minerals, oil, natural gas, and so on up there. United States was mining some of it, the Russians have been mining some of it, and so on. The fact that Canada broke a multilateral body, for no reason. And by the way, since Finland and Sweden are joining NATO, the other 7 members of the Arctic Council will all be NATO members. So they have made the Arctic a confrontation between NATO and Russia. When again, as people who live in the planet, we need to be collaborating about how to protect the Arctic, not, use it as a new battlefield to posture and fight for territory and conduct so-called freedom of navigation exercises and so on. So there's Canada, supposedly the sort of liberal face of North America, essentially pulling the curtains down on the Arctic Council, which was merely a place to have a conversation about what's happening in the Arctic. They said, we will not sit at the table with Russia. I mean, juvenile, and dangerous, both juvenile and dangerous.
Yeah. Well, as I often say, Canada is basically a junior partner in the global imperialist project. We're seeing elements of it there. And Canada has been deeply implicated in Ukraine, to circle back to that as well. Canada has been deeply implicated in creating this kind of like right-wing Ukrainian nationalist Banderite kind of identity, and propagating the idea that that's what Ukraine is, and that's what it always was and always will be, and kind of helping to completely obliterate what remained of the long tradition of Ukrainian socialism and Ukraine's important role as a country in the USSR. And Canada has been deeply implicated in that. That's why we have monuments in Canada to Waffen SS divisions of people that helped carry out the Holocaust. That's what.
What? Tell me about this. I mean, I know you have a foreign minister who, has some relatives from the Banderites thing, and she's been denying it and so on. But tell me about these statues. I have no idea about this.
I would be happy to. Yeah. Well, first of all, Freeland, who you're talking about, the deputy prime minister, her grandfather, Michael Chomiak, was a fascist sympathizer from Ukraine, living in fascist-occupied Poland during World War II, and it was kind of his lifelong project to kind of rehabilitate these anti-Soviet Ukrainian nationalists, such as Bandera, who helped carry out the Holocaust and perpetuate this kind of double genocide theory about the Soviet Union and the Nazis. And after World War II, this is a really interesting story that I've learned over the last couple of years, which is that prior to the war, Canada's largest socialist newspaper was written in Ukrainian. And we had this very socialistic Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. And then after World War II, Canada deliberately imported scores of these former SS members and Ukrainian far-right nationalists, brought them into the country like legally in our immigration system, partially to just disrupt this kind of socialistic Ukrainian diaspora, also to act as muscle in these like anti-union movements. And as a result, Canada has this incredibly large one, I think the largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world, and we literally have monuments that have been erected to these Waffen SS divisions. There's been a lot of controversy in this country as people have started to pay attention to this and one ask these basic questions. I thought we were against the Nazis. Why do we have monuments to SS divisions in this country? But we do, and Canada's played a large role in that process of rehabilitating these kinds of nationalistic anti-Soviet figures, and has used the World War II and used the fact that Canadian troops have very bravely and correctly fought against fascism in World War II to suggest that we're, our ruling class is against it as well. But we've been a central figure globally in kind of rehabilitating fascism and rehabilitating these specific groups of Ukrainian nationalists. So that's one of the reasons Canada has been, in this conflict, one of the leading cheerleaders for it, because that's been a central part of our post-war project in terms of our rehabilitation of these Ukrainian anti-Soviet figures. Very disturbing.
Wow, that's very, very interesting. So that I have often thought about why Canada is sort of runs in the lead on some of these issues. It's not always the case. Like, for instance, in Venezuela, it was easy to see why Canada was even doing a worse politics than the United States from when Chavez first won the election. Well, that had a lot to do with, the mining companies, particularly Barrick Gold, which was led by the great intellectual of the mining companies, Mr. Monk. And, what's his name? Peter Monk or something. Monk was like the leader of the mining establishment. And he wrote an article in the Canadian papers calling for the overthrow of Chavez, calling him authoritarian after Chavez had overseen 3 elections already, for a Constitution Assembly, for his own election in 1999 and so on. I mean, I understood that. That was clear, right? That was directly about the mining companies in Canada. But this has bewildered me. So thanks a lot. That was super interesting.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. It's been an eye-opening for me as someone that kind of grew up in this society and maybe believed a lot of the kind of propaganda that we get taught about in Canada as being the kind of polite, kind, Western country that's post-racial and all this nonsense that we tell ourselves. Deeply, deeply reactionary country, and it's kind of hidden under this surface of civility. And it's been eye-opening for me to learn about this, and that's why I think when the conflict started with Russia and Ukraine, I was a little bit more equipped to understand the context of it, because I had been learning about this kind of stuff, and I knew that Canada in the around the 2015 after the Maidan was Canadian intelligence were arming and training these fascist militias in eastern Ukraine, which is something that, as a socialist, a Marxist, I am against sending weapons to these open white supremacists and Nazis. Apparently, this has become like a controversial thing for some reason in our culture, but I was against that when I learned about it, and I think that provided me a little bit more context and a little bit more understanding when this conflict really began. In Canada's role in creating the situation and provoking it.
Wow. I mean, that's mind-blowing. Now, Rob, I have to leave you in like 5 minutes if that's okay.
That's great. No, it's been wonderful to have you back on the show. I don't want to keep you too much longer. Before you go, Vijay, I just had one final question for you, which is, have you seen the film Avatar: The Way of Water? Have you got a chance to catch that yet? And if you have, follow-up question, if you have, do you think Ho Chi Minh would have been a fan of this film?
Okay, so I am generally an enormous fan of mainstream cinema. That's for one. Secondly, I did go and see the Black Panther movie, and I gave a talk in New York right after, and I upset a lot of people because I gave the game away, as it were, for that film. So I vowed to take a vow of silence, not to talk about films, unless I get hired by somebody to be a professional film critic and get training in how not to give the game away. So
you correctly described Black Panther as being imperialist propaganda, as I remember, and I agree with
I did say that it's an extraordinarily well-made film and highly entertaining, but I also gave the game away.
Yeah,
and so I refuse to say whether I've seen or not seen the film, but I will say that Ho Chi Minh, given the kind of life he led, didn't get a chance to see many films. His only enjoyment in life, well, I shouldn't say only, I don't want to talk about the other enjoyments that I know yet, but his principal diversion in life was smoking cigarettes. And he smoked a lot. And his favorite cigarette was Lucky Strikes, which is a US cigarette. And he used to tell people, look, bring me Lucky Strikes. And he would say, my only concession to the United States is that they make the best cigarettes. And I have often thought about that and felt, wow, that's a sophisticated, he's getting bombed by the United States. And he says, they make some really good cigarettes. I would like to say there's a lot of things. I have a list of things that the US does well. I'm not going to say what my list is, but there's a list of things. I'm sophisticated enough to say that US imperialism is an abomination. But my goodness, there's a lot of things that they do well. Well, one of them, in my opinion, is excellent rock and roll music. And I'm an enormous fan of punk rock and rock and roll in general, including rock and roll that other people might find boring. I find quite elevating.
Yeah, like Steely Dan, for instance.
Steely Dan, exactly. We had that in common. But when I was young, I liked a lot of US punk rock. The Dicks, for instance, a terrific band. The punk rock music from California that I really liked. Yo La Tengo, things like that. So yes, in the line of Ho Chi Minh, I would say Ho Chi Minh loved American cigarettes. He didn't get to watch many films, and I am certainly not going to offer an opinion on Avatar #2.
Okay, well, if you haven't seen it, I recommend you go check it out. I think you might enjoy it. Maybe we can privately have a discussion about this, so you don't get canceled. But Vijay, thank you again.
Please cancel me. If you cancel me, I'll have a vacation.
Yeah, you won't have to do this anymore. No, that would be nice, wouldn't it? Thank you so much, Vijay. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you again. Thank you for joining us on the program. We'll do it in another year. I'll reach out to you and we'll have your annual visit.
Anytime, just write and we'll fix it and I'll come back and we'll have fun together. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for teaching me about Canadian fascism.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure. I'll talk to you.